This is a 1964 book called Flat Stanley by Jeff Brown, pictures by Tommy Ungerer. Flat Stanley. For JC and Tony. Breakfast was ready. I will go wake up the boys, Mrs. Lambie Hop said to her husband, George Lambie Hop. Just then, their younger son, Arthur, called from the bedroom. Hey, come and look, hey! Mr. and Mrs. Lambie Hop went into the bedroom. Hay is for horses, Arthur, not people, Mr. Lambie Hop said. Try to remember that. Excuse me, Arthur said, but look. He pointed to his brother Stanley's bed. Stanley's big bulletin board had fallen on top of him while he was asleep. But Stanley was not hurt. In fact, he had gone right on sleeping until he heard Arthur shouting. What's going on in here? Stanley called out cheerfully from under the bulletin board. Mr. and Mrs. Lambie Hop lifted up the board. Heavens, said Mrs. Lambie Hop. Gosh, said Arthur, Stanley's flat. Flat as a pancake, said Mr. Lambie Hop. Darndest thing I've ever seen. Let's all have breakfast, Mrs. Lambie Hop said. Then I will take Stanley to see Dr. Dan. How do you feel, Stanley? Dr. Dan asked. Does it hurt very much? I felt sort of tickly for a while, Stanley Lambie Hop said, but I feel fine now. Well, that's mostly how it is with these cases, said Dr. Dan. Mrs. Lambie Hop said that Stanley would need new clothes now, but it would be hard to find the right size. Dr. Dan's nurse measured Stanley. He was 4 feet tall, about a foot wide, and a half an inch thick. When Stanley got used to being flat, he enjoyed it. He could go in and out of his rooms even when the door was closed. He would just lie down and slide through the crack at the bottom. Mr. and Mrs. Lambie Hop were quite proud of him. Arthur got jealous and tried to slide under a door too, but he just banged his head. Being flat could also be a help, Stanley found. But he was taking a walk with Mrs. Lambie Hop one afternoon when her best ring fell from her finger. The ring rolled across the sidewalk and down between the bars of a grating. Mrs. Lambie Hop began to cry. I have an idea, Stanley said. He took the laces out of his shoes and another pair out of his pocket. He tied them all together to make one long lace. Then he tied the end of that to go to the back of his belt and gave the other end to his mother. Lower me down, he said, and I will look for the ring. Thank you, Stanley, Mrs. Lambie Hop said. She let him down between the bars and moved him up and down and from side to side. Two policemen came by and stared at Mrs. Lambie Hop. What's the matter, lady? The first policeman asked. Is your yo-yo stuck? I am not playing with a yo-yo, Mrs. Lambie Hop said. My son is at the other end of the shoelace, if you must know. Get the net, Harry, said the second policeman. We have caught a cuckoo. Just then Stanley cried out, Hooray! Mrs. Lambie Hop pulled him up. He was holding the ring. Good for you, Stanley said. She said. Then she turned to the policeman. A cuckoo indeed, she said. Shame. We are very sorry, lady, the policeman said. People should think twice before saying such rude things, said Mrs. Lambie Hop. And then they should not say them at all. One day, Stanley got a letter from his friend Thomas Anthony Jeffrey, whose family had moved to California. Thomas wanted Stanley to visit him. Oh boy, Stanley said, I would love to go. But Mr. Lambie Hop sighed. A round-trip train or airplane ticket to California costs a lot of money, he said. I will have to think of some cheaper way. That evening, Mr. Lambie Hop brought home a very large brown paper envelope. Now then, Stanley, he said, try this for size. The envelope fit Stanley very well. There was even room left over for an egg salad sandwich made with thin bread and a flat cigarette case filled with milk. They had to put a great many stamps on the envelope, but it was still much cheaper than a train or an airplane ticket to California. The next day, Mr. Lambie Hop put Stanley into his envelope. Mrs. Lambie Hop put in the egg salad sandwich and the cigarette case full of milk. They mailed him from the box on the corner. The envelope had to be folded to fit through the slot, but once he was inside, the box Stanley straightened right up again. Mrs. Lambie was worried because Stanley had never been away from home alone before. She tapped on the box. "Can you hear me, dear?" she called. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," Stanley called back. "Can I eat my sandwich now?" "Wait an hour and try not to get too warm, dear," Mrs. Lambie said. Then she and Mr. Lambie cried out, "Goodbye, goodbye," and went home. Stanley had a fine time in California. When the visit was over, the Jeffreys sent him home in a beautiful white airmail envelope they had made themselves. They wrote, "This end up" on both sides. Mr. Lambie had always liked to take the boys out walking with him on a Sunday afternoon, but it was hard when they were crossing streets or moving about in crowds. It was easier after Stanley got flat. Mr. Lambie found that he could roll Stanley up without hurting him at all. He would tie a piece of string around Stanley to keep him from unrolling and make a little hoop in the string. Then he could carry Stanley like a package and hold on to Arthur with the other hand. Stanley did not mind because he had never much liked to walk. Arthur didn't like to walk either, but he had to. It kind of made him mad. One Sunday afternoon, they met an old friend of Mr. Lambie, a man he had not seen for years. "Well, George, I see you have some wallpaper," the man said. "Going to fix up the house, I suppose." "Wallpaper," said Mr. Lambie. "Oh, no, this is my son Stanley." He untied the string, and Stanley unrolled. "How do you do?" Stanley said. "Nice to meet you, young fellow," the man said. He said to Mr. Lambie. "George, that boy is flat." "Smart, too," Mr. Lambie said. "Stanley is third from the top in his class at school." "Phooey," said Arthur. "This is my other son, Arthur," Mr. Lambie said. "He is not always so rude." Arthur blushed and said he was sorry. Mr. Lambie rolled Stanley up again, and they set out for home. It began to rain. Stanley, of course, got wet just around the edges, but Arthur got soaked. Late that night, Mr. and Mrs. Lambie heard a noise in the living room. They found Arthur on the floor near the bookcase. He had put a great many heavy books on top of himself. "Put some more on me," Arthur said when he saw them. "Don't just stand there. Help me," Mr. and Mrs. Lambie said, sent him back to his bed. But the next morning they talked to Stanley. "Arthur can't help but being jealous," they said. "Be nice to him. You're his big brother after all." Stanley and Arthur went into the park. Many boys were flying beautiful big kites with long tails. Arthur sighed. "Someday," he said, "I will have a big kite and I will win a kite flying contest and be famous like everyone else. Nobody knows who I am these days." Stanley remembered what his parents had said. He went to a boy whose kite was broken and borrowed some string. "Well, you can fly me, Arthur," he said. "Come on." He tied the string to himself and gave Arthur the other end to hold. He ran across the grass sideways to get it up to speed, and then he turned to meet the wind. Up, up, up it went. Up went Stanley, being a kite. He knew just how to fly. He faced full into the wind if he wanted to go up and let it take him from behind when he wanted to go fast. He had only to turn his thin edge to the wind a little at a time, and then he would zoom down towards the earth again. Arthur let out all the string, and Stanley flew high above all the trees. He was a beautiful sight to see. In his green sweater and brown trousers against the pale blue sky, everyone in the park stood still to watch. Stanley flew right and then left in a long match swoops. He zoomed at the ground like a rocket and turned up again toward the sun. He made circles and eights and crosses and a star. Nobody ever flew the way Stanley Lambie flew that day. After a while, Arthur got tired of running about with the end of the string. Stanley went right on, though, showing off. Three boys came up to Arthur and asked him to go with them for a hot dog. Arthur left the string tied to a tree. He did not notice that the wind was blowing the string and getting it all tangled up in the tree. The string got shorter and shorter, but Stanley did not know how low he was until leaves touched his feet. Then it was too late. He was caught in the branches. 15 minutes passed before Arthur and the other boys heard his cries and climbed up to set him free. That evening at bedtime, Arthur said he was sorry, but Stanley was still cross. Mr. and Mrs. O.J. Dart lived in the apartment above the Lambie-Hopps. Mr. Dart was the head of the famous Museum of Art. At breakfast one morning, Stanley heard his mother and father talking about Mr. Dart. Mr. Lambie-Hop was reading his newspaper. I see, said Mr. Lambie-Hop. That mother painting has been stolen from the famous museum. The newspaper says that Mr. O.J. Dart is at his wits' end. The police are no help. Listen to what the chief of police told the newspaper. We think it is a gang of sneak thieves. These are the worst kind. They work by sneakery, which makes them very hard to catch. However, my men and I will keep trying. This next morning, Stanley Lambie-Hop heard Mr. Dart talking to his wife in the elevator. Those sneak thieves are very tricky, Mr. Dart said. They work at night, and the museum is so big we cannot guard every picture at the same time. I fear it is hopeless, hopeless, hopeless. Suddenly, Stanley had an idea. He told it to Mr. Dart. Stanley, Mr. Dart said, if your mother says it is all right, I will put you in your plan to work this very night. Mrs. Lambie-Hop said it was all right, but you will have to take a long nap this afternoon, she said. I won't have you up till all hours unless you do. That evening, after a long nap, Stanley went with Mr. Dart to the famous museum. Mr. Dart took him into the main hall where the best and most important paintings were hung. He pointed to a big painting that showed a man with a beard and a floppy velvet hat. The man was playing a violin for a lady who was lying on a couch. There was a half-man, half-horse person standing behind them. 3 fat children with wings were flying around at the top of the painting. That, Mr. Dart said, is the most expensive painting in the world. There was an empty picture frame on the opposite wall. We shall hear more about that later on. Mr. Dart took Stanley into his office and said, it is time for you to put on a disguise. I already thought of that, Stanley Lambie-Hop said. I brought one, my cowboy suit. Nobody will know me in it. No, Mr. Dart said, you will have to wear the disguise I have picked out. He gave Stanley a long white dress, a pair of little pointed shoes, a wide straw hat, and a wig and a stick. The wig was made of a long golden hair. The stick was carved at the top and had a ribbon on it. In this shepherdess disguise, Mr. Dart said, you will look like a painting that belongs in the main hall. We do not have a cowboy picture in the main hall. Stanley was disappointed. I will look like a girl. That's what I will look like, he said. I wish I had never had this idea. But he was a good sport about it, so he put on the disguise. Back in the main hall, Mr. Dart helped Stanley climb into the empty picture frame. Mr. Dart had put 4 small spikes in the wall, one for each hand and foot to rest on. The frame was a perfect fit. Against the wall, Stanley looked just like a picture, except for one thing, Mr. Dart said. Shepherders are supposed to look happy. They smile at their sheep, at the sky. You do not look happy, Stanley. Stanley tried hard to get a faraway look in his eyes. He even tried to smile a little bit. Mr. Dart backed a few feet and stared at him for a minute. Well, he said, it may not be art, but I like it. He went off to take care of the rest of Stanley's plan. Now Stanley was left alone. It was very dark in the main hall. A little bit of moonlight came through the windows, and Stanley could see the world's most expensive painting on the opposite wall. He felt as though the man with the violin and the lady on the couch and the half-horse person and the winged children were all waiting, as he was, for something to happen. Time passed, and Stanley got very, very tired. Maybe they won't come, he thought. Maybe the sneak thieves won't come at all. The moon went behind a cloud, and the main hall got pitch dark. Stanley felt the hair on the back of his neck prickle under his wig. Creak! The sound came from right out in the middle of the main hall. Stanley saw a tiny yellow line of light. The second the sound came and the light got bigger. A trap door had opened in the floor, and now two men came up through it. Stanley understood everything all at once. These must be the sneak thieves. They had a secret trap door into the museum. That was why they had never been caught. And now tonight they were back to steal the most expensive painting in the world. Stanley held very still in his picture frame and listened to the sneak thieves. That's it, Max, said the first one. This is where we pull a sensational job while everyone else is sleeping. Right, Lothar, said the other man. In all this great city, there is no one to stop us. Ha ha, thought Stanley Lambyhop. That's what you think. The sneak thieves put down their lantern. They took the world's most expensive painting off the wall. What would we do to anyone who tried to capture us, Max? The first man asked. We would kill him. What else? His friend said. That was enough to frighten Stanley. He was even more frightened when Luther came over and stared at him. The sheep girl, Luther said. I thought sheep girls were supposed to smile, Max. This one looks scared. Just in time, Stanley put a faraway look in his eyes again and smiled, sort of. You're scary, Luther, Max said. She's smiling. And what a pretty little thing she is, too. That made Stanley very angry. He waited until the sneak thieves had turned back to the world's most expensive painting. Then he shouted in his loudest voice, Police! Police! Mr. Dart! The sneak thieves are here! The sneak thieves looked at each other. Max, said the first one, I think I heard the sheep girl yell. I think I did too, said Max in his quivery voice. Oh boy, yelling pictures? We both need a rest. You'll get a rest, all right, shouted Mr. Dart. He came rushing in with the chief of police and lots of guards and policemen behind him. You'll get arrested, that's what. The policeman took the sneak thieves off to jail. The next morning in the office of the chief of police, Stanley Lambychop got a medal. The day after that, his picture was in all the newspapers. Now Stanley was famous. Everywhere he went, people stared and pointed at him. He could hear them whisper, Over there, Harriet, over there. That must be Stanley Lambyhop, the one who caught the sneak thieves. And things like that, they would say. But after a few weeks, the whispering and the staring stopped. People had other things to think about. Stanley did not mind being famous. It had been fun, but enough was enough. And then he came another change, and it was not a nice one. People began to laugh and make fun of him as he passed by. Hello, Super Skinny, they would shout. Stanley told his parents how he felt. It's the other kids I mind, he said. They don't like me anymore because I am different, flat. Oh, shame on them, Mrs. Lambyhop said. It is wrong to dislike people for their shapes, or their religion, for that matter, or the color of their skin. I know, said Stanley, only maybe it's impossible for everybody to like everybody. Perhaps, said Mrs. Lambyhop, but they can try. Later that night, Arthur heard the sound of crying in the dark. He crossed the room to Stanley's bed. Are you okay? He said. Go away, Stanley said. Don't be mad at me. Arthur said, You're still mad because I let you get caught in the tree the day you were my kite? Oh, skip it all, will you? Stanley said. I'm not mad. Go away. Please, let's be friends. Arthur began to cry too. Oh, Stanley, he said. Please, look, what's wrong? Stanley was quiet for a long time. Well, the thing is, he said, I'm just not happy anymore. I'm tired of being flat. I want to be a regular shape again, like other people. But I'll have to go on being flat forever. It makes me just sick. Oh, Stanley, Arthur said. He dried his tears on a corner of Stanley's sheet. He could think of nothing more to say. Don't talk about what I just said, Stanley told him. I don't want the folks to worry. They would only make it worse. Oh, you're so brave, Arthur said. You really are. He took hold of Stanley's hand. The two brothers sat together in the dark, being friends. They were still sad, but each one felt a little better than he had before. Suddenly, Arthur had an idea. He jumped up and turned on the light and ran to the big toy box. He began to dig through the box. Stanley sat up in a bed to watch. Arthur pushed inside a football and some lead soldiers and airplanes and lots of wooden blocks. And then he said, aha, he had found what he had wanted, an old bicycle pump. He held it up, and Stanley and he looked at each other. Okay, Stanley said at last, but take it easy. He put the end of the long pump hose in his mouth and closed his lips about it so no air could get out. I'll go slowly, Arthur said. If it hurts or anything, wiggle your hand at me. He began to pump. At first, nothing happened except that Stanley's cheeks puffed out a bit. Arthur kept on pumping. Then suddenly, Stanley's top half began to swell. It's working, shouted Arthur. Pumping away, Stanley spread his arms so that the air could get around inside of him. He got bigger and bigger. The bottoms of his pajamas top popped off. Pop, pop, pop. A minute more and he was all rounded out. Head and body, arms, legs, but not his right foot. That foot stayed flat. Arthur stopped pumping. It's like trying to do the very last bit of those long balloons, he said. Maybe a shake would help. Stanley shook his right foot twice, and with a little whooshing sound, it swelled out to match the left one. There stood Stanley Lambie-Hop as he used to be, as he had never been flat at all. Oh, thank you, Arthur, Stanley said. Thank you very much. The brothers were shaking hands when Mr. Lambie-Hop came into the room with Mrs. Lambie-Hop right behind him. We heard you, said Mr. Lambie-Hop, and talking when you should be asleep, eh? Shame on George, said Mrs. Lambie-Hop. Stanley's round again. You're right, said Mr. Lambie-Hop. Good for you. I did it, said Arthur. I blew him up. Everyone was very excited and happy. And of course, Mrs. Lambie-Hop made hot chocolate, and several toasts were drunk to Arthur for his cleverness. When the little party was over, Mr. and Mrs. Lambie-Hop tucked the boys back into their beds and kissed them, and then they turned out the light. Good night, said Stanley and Arthur. It had been a long and tiring day. Very soon, all the Lambie-Hops were asleep. The end. And that was Flat Stanley, 1964. Jeff Brown.